Hey, and welcome to episode 44 of Think Like a Hacker, the podcast where we chat about WordPress security and innovation. We have one main focus this episode, and that is that WordPress 5.2.3 was released on the evening of September 4, a few days ago. And there were 8 vulnerabilities fixed in that release, and 7 of them were cross-site scripting. So this is the XSS episode. Let's do this. All right, episode 44. Let's go. Kathy, how you doing?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm good. So I guess 5.2.3 was released on September 4th, right?
Yeah, it was kind of late in the day, but you were ready for it, weren't you?
Well, I don't know if I was ready for it, but yeah, we collaborated on a blog post that evening, and we managed to get it out first thing the next morning. And what we did is we unpacked the details of the release, and it's worth noting that we're basing our blog post on the announcement, which kind of calls out the individual vulnerabilities, and then we look at the code. We do a diff on the code, and we have a couple of other techniques that we use to analyze the changes in the code. So we're still waiting for the developers here to give us our POCs, our proof of concepts, right, Kathy?
Yeah, nothing. I did a scan this morning. I haven't seen anything published yet.
Yeah. Do you want to kind of run through the process, how this usually works a few weeks from now when what they're going to release?
Sure. Well, in security research, typically what happens is a researcher will poke at an application, in this case WordPress, and look for vulnerabilities in that code. And if they find one, they develop a proof of concept. And that proof of concept is then sent confidentially to the developer, or to, in this case, WordPress core. And when they see that proof of concept, it really sort of extrapolates everything that needs to be done in order to fix it. And this is all done confidentially so that malicious attackers don't, catch wind of it. Then the release comes out, which patches it, and then, some time goes by so that everybody can, update their sites, and then the researcher will publish their proof of concept of, what they found and how it all works, just to sort of further the education within the security community. So I think there'll probably be another week or so before we start seeing any proof of concepts coming out. So giving everybody time to update their sites. Exactly.
And time going by being the key phrase there. That's kind of the most important concept with responsible disclosure. So this is exactly how we do our research. We'll develop a POC, proof of concept, and we'll use it internally. We'll share it with vendors so that they can use it to check if they've managed to successfully patch the vulnerability. If they've got a QA team, their QA team will actually run the POC against the software to verify that it's now secure. And then when the proof of concept's finally released, and sometimes before then, vendors will actually use that POC to check to develop a firewall rule, and to see if their firewall rule is effective against the attack. And so those proof of concepts, they might seem like sort of nasty, malicious things that can be used by hackers to hack into to a particular vulnerability, and it may seem as if the researcher is actually handing over a hacking tool on a plate, but it's not for that. It's for the purposes that we described. It's for the vendor, and it's for other security vendors to use. So it's kind of an important ingredient in the whole mix. But yeah, so 5.2.3 was released, and like I said, 7 of the 8 vulnerabilities were cross-site scripting. And I'm going to go pretty deep on unpacking some of these. So the first cross-site script. So we'll just do a quick review of what cross-site scripting vulnerability is. And Kathy, you can QA my interpretation of XSS. So cross-site scripting and XSS are used interchangeably to describe this kind of vulnerability. And what this is if you are able to, if an attacker accesses a website and is able to get that website to store malicious code, which a user then loads in their browser the next time they view a page on that site, that's called a stored cross-site scripting vulnerability, or a stored XSS. And there's a different variant on a cross-site scripting vulnerability, which is a reflected XSS. And what that is a attacker sends you a link, and that link contains some nastiness in the URL. And when you click that link, you go to the site, and the site essentially reflects that nastiness back to you, and that loads in your browser, and it does malicious things, and I'll get to what those are in a moment. But those are the two basic kinds of XSS vulnerabilities. You've got stored and reflected, and so reflected, the sort of attack vector is a little different. You have to kind of get someone to click a malicious link, or and then stored, that can affect a lot. Well, I'll say affect a lot more users. It affects users in a different way, because I think both of them can affect quite a lot of users. But in both cases, you're getting the victim to load malicious code in their browser, and that victim might be an administrator on the WordPress site. And so now the attacker is executing code in the admin's browser as that admin, and they can take actions as that administrator. And one of the things they can do is actually create a new user with admin privileges called hacker with password 123, and even send a message to the hacker by loading up a pixel from the hacker's website or whatever, just letting the hacker know, yep, the attack was successful. You can now come in and log in as that new account. And so cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, they're not the sort of sexiest, most glamorous vulnerabilities out there, but they can do a lot of damage, and they can provide full compromise of a website to an attacker. How'd I do, Kathy?
Yeah, you did good. And, we have a Learning Center article on our site from a couple of years ago. We did an analysis of about 1,600 WordPress plugin vulnerabilities reported over a 14-month period. And cross-site scripting was by far the number one vulnerability that we found in that audit of plugin vulnerabilities. So it's a fairly common one. We see it often, don't we, Mark?
Right. Yeah. And the reason why is because code sanitization is the sort of fundamental thing, or lack of code sanitization is the fundamental thing that causes cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. And I say code sanitization, what I actually mean is output sanitization, and to a certain extent input sanitization. And what that means is when a developer is writing code that outputs something to the browser, they need to make sure that thing that is outputted is cleaned of all the nastiness that an attacker could put in there. And that will mitigate a cross-site scripting vulnerability. And then to a certain extent, input sanitization as well, because as you're receiving code, for example, for a stored XSS, if you're about to store that in a database, or for a reflected XSS, as you're receiving that data that you're reading from the URL, for example, if the developer has made sure that they clean that code before it gets processed, that can mitigate an XSS as well. And I said to a certain extent because sometimes it's not feasible to clean code completely. You want to preserve HTML tags and that kind of thing. So it depends on your use case whether you're going to clean the code on input or on output. But either of those techniques. Go ahead.
Can I put you on the spot and give an example of what an output sanitization might look like for even maybe one of these vulnerabilities?
Kathy,
what needed to be done?
They don't allow me to write code anymore. That was banned years ago when we started hiring developers that are way smarter than me. How's that for a cop-out?
Okay.
Yes, okay, I managed to avoid the bullet.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, not going to do that in real time. It's been a minute, but yeah. As I'm literally blushing over here. But anyway.
Okay, sorry.
That's cool. That's cool. Yeah, I might be able to wing it, but I'm not going to take the risk. I don't feel like flying without sort of skydiving without a spare parachute today.
Gotcha.
Too early in the morning for that. Anyway, yeah. So, all right. We'll dive into the changes in 5.2.3. And the first one that we noticed is the cross-site scripting vulnerability that was in post previews. And it specifically says in post previews by contributors. And so, what this suggests is that someone with lower permissions than admin could come in and do something malicious that would cause, and again, cross-site scripting is where you store code or reflect code, and that code is loaded by someone with higher administrative privilege or higher privileges, like an admin. And so they use the word contributors here, which suggests that someone with lower privileges, like a contributor, comes in and can do something in the place where they edit a post, where they're contributing content, that will then be loaded in the in an admin's interface. And when we looked at this, it looks like the post status field, and if I recall correctly, post status is sort of draft or published and so on.
Yeah.
It's not. In MySQL, you have something called an enum, which is an enumerated type. So you have fixed values for a particular field, and post status is actually a drop-down list. And so it should have fixed values, but in fact, it looks like the way WordPress stores that data, it's not as an enum. It's an arbitrary string. And so what we think is that the attacker could define their own value for post status, have that stored in the database, and when an admin comes in and previews that post, that loads up the malicious code. So the malicious code would be in post status. And so the fix was to sanitize that. And if you look at the code, and we've provided a diff in the blog post, which we'll of course link to in the show notes, it looks like they're sanitizing that. And the sanitization actually happened on the client side in JavaScript. But that was the basic sort of idea there of kind of what the exploit vector was and what they fixed. And so it was really what we would call a priv-esque or a privilege escalation vulnerability. We've got all these fancy terms in the security industry, XSS, priv-esque, But but yeah, so this was a priv-esque XSS because it allowed someone to escalate their privileges from contributor to admin potentially via an XSS attack vector, and so not something that would be widely exploited, right, Kathy?
Yeah. I mean, some of the priv-esque, to get all into the nomenclature,
right.
But some of the more popular ones that we've seen have been like a subscriber level, where you have a site that anybody can register on and they become a subscriber, and then they can privilege escalate out of that into an administrator role. But this would have to actually be a contributor, so somebody like a post editor or author, administrator or user type could then escalate to administrator or inject malicious code into that post status field.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so we should give credit where credit's due, and that was Ripstech. And if I recall correctly, so it was Simon Scannell from Ripstech, and Simon actually reported the next vulnerability as well that we'll mention. But Ripstech is a static code analyzer, if I recall correctly. To put you on the spot, Kathy, do you remember? I'm pretty sure they do static code analysis. I quickly load up their site.
They also have a really cool site called coderisk.com, and you can put in any plugin in there, and they actually have an algorithm that does an analysis on the code within that plugin, and gives it sort of a risk score. And I always think that's fun to play with and see what kind of plugins I can come up with like 100 risk score. So most of the more popular plugins have lower risk scores, and then there's some less popular ones that have higher risk scores, but it's actually an algorithm that they have that they do an analysis on that code. Nice.
What was that website or URL again?
It's coderisk.com.
Oh, cool. All right. So Rips, if I recall correctly, used to be don't quote me on this, but I think it was like a pretty basic open source static code analyzer, and I think it might have been written in PHP. And then if I recall correctly, they got all professional, and they started providing a pretty robust product. And I think their pricing, I'm not looking at their pricing right now on the site, but I think you have to contact them. But if I recall correctly, it's not cheap. But I think that Simon and the crew over there are using this static code analyzer to unearth a lot of these vulnerabilities. And static code analyzers are particularly good at finding XSS. So that kind of explains what might be going on here. And just to unpack that a little bit, static code analysis is where you take code that is static and not compiled and not running in the wild, and you run an analyzer on it that uses all sorts of techniques. I'm not going to say machine learning. I'm not going to say AI because well, first of all, AI doesn't exist, and some of them probably do use machine learning algorithms. I'm not sure what RIPS does, but that's the basic concept there. And so if you're looking for a good static code analyzer, check out RIPS. But yeah, so the next vulnerability was also discovered by Simon, and this is a cross-site scripting vulnerability in stored comments. And the description there suggests that it's a stored XSS because they're comments, and so a malicious actor would be able to go in and put bad code into a comment and then have other people, including a site admin, potentially load that and do bad things. We didn't get much data on this. I don't know what the severity is here, how exploitable this is, but I did put a note in our blog post that said this alone should strongly encourage users to upgrade ASAP, because if it's a stored comments vulnerability, it suggests that it's actually very widely exploitable. This is different to the post preview by contributors XSS, where you had to be a contributor to exploit it. This could be exploited by anyone out on the internet, and we've seen some very nasty and very widely exploited XSSs that are like this, where it's not Prevesc, where you don't need existing permissions to exploit. So yeah, again, not much detail on there. I'm assuming that Simon and RIPS will release a POC and some more detail on this in the next week or two. But upgrade, because this is a little spooky, right?
Yeah, definitely. Be interesting to see what's going on with this one, especially since we have that threat actor that we've been reporting on recently that has been going after some cross-site scripting vulnerabilities and plugins. So when that proof of concept comes out, it'll be interesting to see if they pick up on that.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so number 3 out of 7 XSSs is a validation and sanitization of a URL leads to open redirect. And so what an open redirect is if your site if your site allows an attacker to craft a URL that redirects people to certain places, then what they can do is, open redirects are mostly used in phishing attacks, phishing with a PH, of course, where an attacker will send you an email and they're trying to get you to click on a link. And once you click on that link, they'll take certain actions. So one of the things that the attacker might encounter is that spam filters and security filters are filtering out their website because their website's known for malicious activity. So if they can find a website that they can bounce users off to their malicious site, that gives them a much higher rate of success because the filters don't catch on. So if your site has an open redirect, an attacker will use that redirect. They'll include your URL in their spam campaign or in their attack campaign, and they'll craft the link so that your site is redirecting users to a bad place, either a place that is compromising user browsers or trying to get them to, presenting them with a fake login screen, for example, trying to get them to hand over their credentials and so on. And that can really hurt you because your URL is included in an attack campaign or a spam campaign, and so you're blacklisted. And so you really don't want an open redirect on your site. And so it's really cool that they discovered this and they fixed it. And yeah, in the blog post, I give a couple of scenarios where a open redirect can be used. But does that about capture it, Kathy? The many nefarious uses or some of the nefarious uses of an open redirect?
Yeah, as far as I know. And I think the most important thing that you pointed out is that blacklisting risk, that if your URL is blacklisted, it takes a while to clean that up. So definitely want to make sure you're updated so that this can't be used. Yeah,
for sure. So this was disclosed by Tim Cohen, and we linked to Tim's blog on our blog post, and that's security-consulting.icu/blog. So it looks like Tim does a bit of security consulting, and he's got a blog there that you can check out as well. So yeah, thanks Tim for helping out the community, much appreciated. All right, the next one was a reflected cross-site scripting during media uploads, and we took a look at this. We actually looked at the code, and it looks like if you can get I actually ended up quoting, I think, Mikey on this because I was chatting with him as he was analyzing the code. But if you can get the media sort of upload facility in WordPress to accept a cross-site scripting payload, then you can launch a cross-site scripting attack. And so they added sanitization there. And or as Mikey put it, if you could jam an XSS payload into a media upload file name, this would result in an XSS. And so WordPress 5.2.3 no longer allows that attack vector. And this vulnerability was disclosed by Anshul Jain. And Anshul, unfortunately, the announcement didn't include a link to Anshul's profile or blog or anything like that. So I wasn't able to include a link to him or her. And but yeah, if we do discover Anshul, where Anshul lives, we'll definitely include that or tweet it. But thanks very much for contributing that one, Anshul. And then there's another XSS in shortcode previews. This would allow a malicious user with lower privileges to inject code in a shortcode that, when previewed, potentially by an administrator again, would be executed in that user's browser. And of course, they can do all sorts of malicious things there. So this was discovered by Zuyong Yang, and Zuyong also didn't get a link. So if you do know who Anshul or Zuyong are, or you have their URLs, hit us up, and we'll include that in the comments on the blog post. And then the sixth one was a cross-site scripting vulnerability in the WordPress dashboard. This was Ian Dunn from the WordPress core security team discovered this. And this is a reflected XSS. So someone could potentially craft a link that takes you to your own site's dashboard and then loads malicious code in the dashboard and performs nefarious actions with your privileges. So that one feels a little bit more serious, right, Kathy?
Yeah, it definitely does. Could definitely cause some problems there. Yeah.
It feels like it's got the potential for a mass exploit with, if you discover a list of, say, 100,000 WordPress sites and do an email campaign with the XSS payload and send links to the site owners. And I don't think it's super hard to get the email addresses associated with WordPress sites. Or even to infer what they are and potentially get like a 10% or 20% hit rate, you could potentially mass exploit this. So really nice catch there from Ian, from the core security team. And then the seventh and final XSS is from Surush Dalili from NCC Group. And Surush, you must excuse my pause before your name there. I want to make sure I don't butcher it too badly. But this is Surush disclosed an XSS vulnerability caused by URLs not being sanitized correctly. And that's the only data that we have. There's no more detail on that. In the blog post, we include some additional notes, and we've noticed some other file changes in this release. And one of the things we noticed is that in wp-admin/edit-form-blocks.php, there was a change where they switched from using file exists to isFile. And we think that the reason they did that is because file exists. If your php.ini is configured with allow URL fopen to on, then file exists can actually accept a URL and fetch that URL. And fetching a URL is opens sites up to vulnerabilities, and I'm going to go off on a tangent on this in a moment, but that's probably why they switched to file exists. But yeah, to sort of go off on my tangent, Kathy, I think, well, you obviously know about the internal project that we're working on, and one of the things that we've been looking at is using Headless Chrome. Have you seen the conversations on Slack about that a little bit?
Yeah, a bit. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I chatted with Matt B, our lead developer. And in developing this particular application, and Headless Chrome is super useful for a whole bunch of things. But and what Headless Chrome is it gives you the ability to run Chrome without a monitor. Essentially, you can run it on a server in memory, and you can access the output of Chrome or the DOM. In other words, the rendered HTML page via an API. And so you can simulate browser activity, and it's super, super useful. But if you're playing with Headless Chrome, you probably want to think about this. So if you're developing an application where you're allowing users to give you a URL that is then loaded within Headless Chrome, the users can give you a URL to a site that is malicious, and that site is loaded within your Headless Chrome. And what you're doing is you're allowing that site to execute code on your server. And so that it opens you up to a whole bunch of exploits, and you have to make super sure that that Headless Chrome instance is very well sandboxed, and that the malicious site that has now been loaded can't kind of break out of that sandbox and get code exec on the box. And so, that's an extreme example of giving someone the ability to load a URL within your application. This is a much more kind of tame version of that, where file exists would load a URL, but it's kind of the same thing, a little bit related. So that's probably why they made that change. And then they made a change in WP Sanitize.js, which does a little bit more when it comes to sanitization. Now they've made it a recursive routine, which means that it calls itself with its own output repeatedly until the output stops changing. So it'll just keep sanitizing until no more sanitization is needed. And in the back of my mind, I'm wondering if there are cases where that recursion won't stop because it's kind of flipping back and forth. But I'm sure they've thought of that. So yeah, that 7 XSSs, not too bad, Kathy?
You covered them quite well as well, so that's pretty cool. I was so impressed with the fact that you guys just jumped on this, unpacked it all, and were able to really identify how important this release was in such a short period of time. So kudos to you and the team. Yeah,
well, that's just us covering the story. I mean, the real I'm not going to say the real MVP. The real heroes here are the core team for cranking out these fixes, and then of course the security researchers that contributed these fixes. And so there's one more, and that is jQuery. And this is not an XSS; it's just an update in jQuery to well, actually, it is an XSS. We have 8 XSSs. A cross-site scripting vulnerability was discovered in jQuery.extend, and that was fixed in jQuery 3.4.0. Now, WordPress uses its own version of jQuery, and I use the term version loosely because they backported the fix in 3.4.0 to jQuery in WordPress, which is, it says in the comments, version 1.12.4. They made the code changes, but they never incremented the version number. And so I don't know how that works. If anyone knows how you do a software release without changing the version and why that's a good idea, please let me know, because that seemed a little weird to me. But anyway, there was a fix in jQuery that was ported into WordPress's version, and that was included in WordPress 5.2.3 as well. So that pretty much sums up the release, and you can read about the full story on our blog. And not too bad, Kathy?
Yeah, I think it's pretty awesome that this release came out so quickly and keeping WordPress safe.
Yeah, all right. So I believe you have another story.
I have another story, and it's not WordPress related, but it affects WordPress users, so I kind of wanted to cover this one. And on, let's see, what date was it? This article that I'm reading is from August 31st, so it was a bit ago. And on the 30th, it looks like Jack Dorsey, who is the CEO of Twitter, his Twitter account was compromised, and some really nasty, politically incorrect and horrible things were posted on his account that I'm sure Jack would have never written. And we got sort of the post-mortem on this from a number of sources. I was reading from The Verge, and they talked about what happened, and it was a SIM port attack. And because we've talked about SIM port attacks on Think Like a Hacker before, and because SIM port attacks affect each and every one of us with a cell phone, and using cell phones for authentication in any way, I think it's important to be aware, and just another case where it underscores the importance of using a authenticator-based or a time-based code rather than an SMS code for two-factor authentication. So what ended up happening, from what they've said, is Jack Dorsey used AT&T as his mobile provider, and a group called Chuckling Squad took over that account. And they've been playing that trick for years, according to The Verge, and they've had a string of online influencers that they've attacked. And they seem to have a particular trick with AT&T. Verge has reached out to AT&T and did not respond, did not receive a response from AT&T. So what ended up happening is basically the SIM card that is in your cell phone basically tells your cell phone provider, this is, Kathy's aunt's phone, or this is Jack Dorsey's phone. And if they have a new SIM card in their system that is saying that phone, B over there is now Jack Dorsey's phone, that's where the codes and that's where all of the authentication is going to go towards. So what they actually did is they ported that SIM to a new phone, and they were actually using Twitter's capabilities of being able to send a text message to 40404 to post to Jack's account from that phone, and basically compromised his Twitter account that way. Twitter actually shut down SMS for the entire network until they could identify what exactly had transpired here, but it actually was a SIM port attack. So WordFence has updated our actual login security so that we are encouraging our users to migrate away from SMS two-factor authentication and start using the time-based authentication using an authenticator like Google Authenticator or Authy, or there's a few other ones out there as well. We really need to be using two-factor authentication everywhere. For your Twitter account, as well as for your WordPress installations, just because we've had so many data breaches happen, so many username and passwords have been dumped out into the wild, and these passwords and usernames are being used in credential stuffing or breach, attacks going after, and we've seen it attacking numerous SaaS services as well as WordPress sites. We have helped a number of customers who have had these types of attacks coming at them. So we really encourage you to use two-factor authentication wherever and whenever and wherever you have authentication, because usernames and passwords just aren't enough. And just to heighten the awareness, here's another case. The case that we talked about previously was talking about cryptocurrency users and Coinbase accounts, but now we're talking about Twitter, and we're just going to see more and more cases in which SMS-based two-factor authentication is going to be compromised. So I actually started researching a while ago some service providers, including banks, to see how prevalent two-factor TOTP, or the time-based code, is being used, and it's kind of depressing. I was looking at the banking industry specifically, and I was starting to see that there's so many of our banks are using 2FA, but they're using the SMS-based. Have you noticed this, Mark?
Yeah, I have.
It's kind of depressing.
Yeah, it is. You know what's really depressing? Is it looks like Twitter still does this SMS text to tweet thing.
Yeah.
I'm confused. I mean, so just to kind of go back to this attack, they basically social engineered AT&T into porting Dorsey's number over to their SIM card, and then were able to post to the account. And, Alex Stamos, I think, put it well when he said, I forget the metaphor that he used, but it was something along the lines of, this is like stealing a Bugatti and then crashing it into the first lamppost that you encounter. They could have done so much more. If you look at the list of tweets, it's just so clearly script kiddies. It was, Corey done the job, Aqua up this bitch, hashtag Chuckling Squad, get it trending for the Twitter password. I mean, it's just garbage, and then they promote their Discord, their chat service. It's ridiculous. But so it's just script kiddies that did it. But it could have been much worse. I think that some damage could have been done at least for the 15 minutes that the account was compromised. And the weird thing is that I'm on Twitter's help page, and they tell you exactly how to set this up. In fact, it's I think it's already available to you if you've added your mobile number to your Twitter account. So yeah, that is pretty sad.
Yeah, it is. And I think the reason why I really wanted to cover this is just underscoring the fact that people need to, and in a couple of talks that I've given, the awareness of, you know, how insecure our phones are. I mean, we're carrying them with us all the time, and we're texting, I'm sure, all kinds of sensitive information. And it's not secure. And we're finding yet another high profile case that's, you know, sort of the canary in the coal mine that we need to start thinking about our mobile devices as not secure, and look at other ways of authenticating and other ways of communicating that are secure. It's becoming more and more important.
I must say, I kind of take, to the view I take on this is that there's two aspects to our mobile devices. The one is that they are cell phones, and those cell phones use standards that date back to the 1990s. That component is fairly insecure. You know, the concept of a SIM card, of SMSs, of phone calls via the cell phone network, and so on. And I think therein lies a lot of the vulnerability when it comes to cell phones. The other part of it is that it's essentially a kind of workstation. It's a computer, and that computer has the ability to run applications, and it has the ability to access the network either via the cell phone system or via Wi-Fi. And that computer is not a heck of a lot different from your desktop. And if you think about it that way, you know, you can replace a lot of the cell phone functionality that you have with the functionality that the computer provides, which is much more secure. So for example, you can use end-to-end encryption, which I think, for example, WhatsApp provides. And so using WhatsApp instead of sending an SMS is much more secure, because your communication is end-to-end encrypted, if you trust the owner of Facebook. But I think it's fairly well established that it's encrypted. And there's a few other applications that you can use as well to provide end-to-end encryption. SMS is not that. It is insecure and to the extreme. And then for authentication, you know, again, you can use the computer in your cell phone to do pretty darn secure authentication, time-based one-time passwords, for example. You can get a Google Authenticator loaded on your phone, and that can vastly improve the security of your various user accounts. But then you've got the cell phone aspect, where if you're using that as a second factor, if you're using SMS, that is not secure, because what can happen is someone can just port your SIM card over to their phone, and Bob is in fact their uncle, because they will compromise your site, even though you've got 2FA, or your account, even though you've got 2FA installed. So yeah, I think just thinking about it in that way, you know, where you've got those two aspects of it, and try to get away from the cell phone thing and use the computer aspect of your cell phone. And just to get on my soapbox a little bit, you know how much I enjoy that. You know, there's another aspect to cell phones, and that is call spam, and that's a total pain. So I rarely even use the cell phone functionality on my cell phone. I use it as a computer, as a little mini workstation. If someone phones me, I actually rarely answer it anymore, unless I know exactly who it is, because of the amount of spam. To be honest, I don't even check my voicemail. If it's important, you know, folks will send me an email. You know, that's kind of where I get my important messages. And I know that some smart people that I'm friends with, years ago, they started putting up a voicemail that said, hey, I don't check my voicemail. The best way to get hold of me is via email. And, you know, one tries to have a voicemail like that doesn't sound too, I don't know, elite or making yourself inaccessible. But just as a practical matter, I think using computers like our cell phone, using our cell phone as a computer to communicate is much more secure, and it tends to be more effective than using it as an actual cell phone. What's your mileage on this, Kathy? You get a lot of spam?
I do, and I started using this RoboKiller app that just basically engages anybody that's sort of in their database of a spam caller, engages them, and it could be pretty funny because it's trying to get them to basically waste time and
Wait, so it actually, because I was going to make a joke about this thing engaging them, and I assumed you were going to say, oh no, it just kind of hangs up on them. But you're saying it actually like picks up and talks to them?
Yeah.
I was going to joke, oh, wouldn't it be cool if it does that? But it actually does that?
Yeah, it does. It's got different recording. You can either record your own, or you can use, I just let it like choose whichever one. And there's one that was like this Russian guy. Wait a minute, I need to ask wife. It's hilarious. And so then you get the recording, right? And so you could get to hear this spammer like engaging with, this recording. And it's some of them can be hilarious. Like I had one guy, he was like, oh, not this again, and he was getting really frustrated. So that, I'm all about the comedy. I mean, if I can get some comedy out of a spammer, I will. It's a really cool app. It's called RoboKiller.
Today I learned.
It's a lot of fun.
Wow, that's epic. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
Do you have that on Android or iPhone or?
I think it works for both. I've got an iPhone, so.
Sweet. Yeah, cool. Awesome. Well, we might even include a link to that in the show notes. But that is it for this week's episode. So if you're watching on YouTube, give us a like and a subscribe. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, leave us a positive review if you liked us, and just don't say anything if you don't like us, because that would be awesome. Thanks. But that's it for this week's episode. Have an awesome rest of your week, everyone. Bye.